From my point of view, World War III is already happening. Around 2001, 2002, we entered into a completely new dynamic of conflict that's called proxy conflict. The whole proxy strategy opens the door to a completely new type of nuclear threat. There's also been developments in new types of nuclear weapons. Anybody with any kind of military or intelligence background knows that Iran is behind this. Primary driver behind October 7th was to create the chaos that we're seeing right now. It's in Iran's best interest to keep this conflict going. It's in Hamas's best interest to keep this conflict going. Because every day that Israel kills more Palestinians, the world turns against Israel. The bigger threat to you, me, and the average person is the chaos that would follow. The longer it takes for people to decide what to do next, the longer the atrocities continue. We're in a dangerous, dangerous place.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel we have Andrew Bustamante, who's a highly decorated U.S. Air Force combat veteran and respected corporate consultant. He spent his military career specializing in nuclear ICBM operations, and after winning decorations in both Afghanistan and Iraq, Andrew was recruited into the CIA's National Clandestine Service, where he served 7 years and handled classified top secret operations, obviously. He currently runs the website everydayspy.com, a YouTube channel which is growing in popularity that I encourage everybody to go and check out after this video, and has been featured on multiple viral podcast interviews. So it's a pleasure to have you on today, man. I hope to get your perspective on global affairs, but also to gain some insights into your line of work, as well as maybe some prepping tips for my audience. And one thing I really appreciate about your podcast is that you provide very easy to understand but high level analysis of current events, and it's surprisingly transparent as well in light of your resume. So welcome aboard.
I appreciate it, Nate. Thanks for having me. And you know, it's funny, I'm shocked how often people comment on the transparency or the authenticity of the conversations that I get to have. And, you know, there's no reasonable explanation as to why that level of transparency hasn't been available to us in the past. I'm not breaking any laws. I'm not violating any agreements with U.S. law enforcement, with CIA, with the military. But for some reason, open, honest conversation has become something that's rare and special.
Yeah, I think it's surprised a lot of people. And, you know, I do plan on asking a few questions about, you know, your line of work and some misconceptions perhaps about, you know, the CIA and all that stuff. But first, I was hoping to get your perspective on, you know, what the geopolitical state of affairs is around the world. We're in very precarious times, have been for quite some time, I would say. What are some of the biggest threats you think we face in the world today from a geopolitical standpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I want to start with two main things, and they're questions that get floated around often in, you know, internet circles as well as in real life circles. And those two questions are: one, is World War III going to happen? And two, what's the future of Western economies, right? Economies based on the US dollar, basically. And those are two really important questions. And to me, they are the two most paramount questions that anybody should be asking for the next anywhere from 5 to 10 years. And from my point of view, World War III is already happening. It just doesn't look the way people expected it to look. We all expected World War III would look like World War II. And a big part of that is because of what we see in media and what we see in movies and TV shows. You know, we expected some sort of big charismatic bad guy with nuclear weapons and a giant military would create some sort of crazy invasion of the United States or Canada or Europe. And that's why we looked at Russia and looked at China and looked at their militaries with such skepticism and such villainy over the last 7 to 12 years, because we've been waiting for one of them to become this huge new Nazi party. You know, we expected World War II to repeat itself. Instead, what actually happened was around 2001, 2002, when the US started the global war on terror, we entered into a completely new dynamic of conflict that's called proxy conflict. Proxy conflict is when large, wealthy economies fund wars in poor third world countries or developing countries. Because now what that does is it insulates the wealthy country against loss of life and loss of capital and loss of resources, but it allows them to execute foreign policy against their adversaries. So when you look at what happened in Syria, when you look at what happened in Libya, when you look at Yemen, when you look at Ukraine, when you look at Israel and Palestine right now, when you consider the global war on terror and what the United States did in Iraq and Afghanistan, really what you had there were the first inclinations, the development of this new World War III methodology, this proxy war that puts the lives of developing nations and third world countries on the line in order to gain economic dominance by the proxy funding source.
So this proxy conflict, or these proxy conflicts that we see unfolding right now, they're also a way to avoid a nuclear escalation, I presume. Knowing that we're in this era of hybrid warfare, what do you believe the likelihood of an actual nuclear incident is? We know you have a lot of experience in this line of work, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about the specifics in a bit more depth. But yeah, what do you think the prospect is then of that happening in light of the fact that most countries are aware of this threat, which is why they're fighting it by proxy?
So you're exactly right. The proxy strategy de-escalates the risk of what we call interstate war, interstate nuclear war, which means we're not going to see an ICBM launch out of Russia and hit the United States. It's just unlikely because Russia and the United States aren't at war, right? If China invades Taiwan in some way, China and the United States aren't at war. So you wouldn't expect to see ICBMs fly. You wouldn't expect nuclear cruise missiles tipped with nuclear warheads. You wouldn't expect to see nuclear submarines deployed because we're not escalating a conflict between nuclear-powered nations. But the whole proxy strategy opens the door to a completely new type of nuclear threat. Because along with the development of new military strategies, there's also been developments in new types of nuclear weapons. The birth of the tactical nuke, the birth of the suitcase nuke. I mean, these are small nuclear devices that can be hand smuggled across a border. They can be triggered from a cell phone remote in a city in a briefcase that's stashed in someone's hotel room. That's terrifying, right? And when a nuclear blast like that goes off, it's not going to decimate a city like we saw in Nagasaki or Hiroshima. It's going to decimate a very small targeted area. So now if you have a G20 summit happening in Dubai and a suitcase nuke gets put into the same hotel where the meetings are happening, you essentially could take out every leader in the G20 with a target nuke that doesn't even kill them with a fireball, but brings the entire building down. That's a whole new kind of threat that countries have to deal with. And when a blast like that goes off, think about what the repercussions are going to be in media. Was it a conventional bomb? How did people miss it? And then eventually it'll come out that there's a nuclear signature or a radiation signature, and then they'll say it's a radioactive bomb. How did this bomb get put in there? How did a nuclear bomb get placed in a neutral third country? And then who's going to be held accountable for it? The country that owns nuclear weapons, or some third-party threat that delivered the weapon, or the country that was unable to secure its own borders? You can see how messy this would get, right, Nate? Very different from a satellite that sees an ICBM fly out of Russia and impact Ukraine.
So you're saying there would be some plausible deniability with respect to who was culpable for the attack. Is there not unique signatures from which they could deride who exactly this is, who was where the nuclear material came from?
Unfortunately, no. And most nuclear material is actually bought, sold, and traded on the open market. So you can buy your uranium, you can buy your plutonium from any number of places in the world, right? A lot of uranium that's mined in the United States is actually bought in China. So the uranium that the Russians use comes from all over Europe. It's a very difficult thing to track when it comes to the materials. There is such a thing as MASINT, or measurements intelligence. which would come to play and help to identify as much as possible. But the bigger threat to you, me, and the average person is the chaos that would follow. So consider this scenario, right? Here's my biggest nightmare scenario for what's going on in Ukraine right now. My nightmare scenario is that a tactical, hand-carried nuclear weapon is delivered into Kiev, smuggled through Belarus, and it comes, obviously, most likely, with some sort of Russian-made device. If that bomb goes off in Kiev, who's accountable? Who does the EU, who does NATO, who does the United States blame? And what's the next step in the conflict? Does NATO invade Belarus? Do we launch an ICBM from the United States at Russia? Do we go to war with Russia, or does everything just stay the same?
Right. And if everything stays the same, then one of my primary concerns would be that there's a new level of normalization of use of tactical weapons.
Exactly right, man. Exactly right. And what the world is struggling with is, how do you de-incentivize? How do you create the right kind of repercussion to prevent escalation in that direction? Because the longer it takes for someone to decide what to do next, the more the atrocities happen. Look what's happening in Iraq and Israel. Look what's happening in Israel right now between the Israeli government, the Hamas government, separate from the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. The longer it takes for people to decide what to do next, the longer the atrocities continue. So we've been in a prolonged ceasefire right now. But even through that ceasefire, the messaging that's coming from both governments is that this conflict will continue, bombing rates will continue, and they will escalate, and more lives will be lost. That's happening because we can't discourage Israel against their campaign fast enough, and we can't discourage Hamas against guerrilla terrorist tactics fast enough.
Yeah, I hope to get your input on that theater of conflict in just a moment. But going back to the Ukrainian front, what do you think the response of NATO would be should the use of nuclear weapons be presented in some way in that theater?
That's what's tricky. NATO, by all accounts, is showing that it wants out of Ukraine. NATO does not want to be part of this anymore. You saw a complete change in government in the Netherlands. You've watched as Hungary from the beginning has not wanted to be part of this. You've seen France and Germany step away. You saw Poland on the brink of changing their entire policy because of a change in government. Like, these are true European NATO partners that have long supported Ukraine, and they don't want to be part of this. So all the other countries, all of your smaller Romanias and whatever else in NATO, they're just going to go with whatever the predominant opinion is. The force driving NATO to support Ukraine is the United States. And the NATO leadership is so frustrated with the United States bullying their decision-making that you're actually seeing strife between Spain, Germany, France, and the Biden administration here in the United States. They want independence from the United States, because what we're seeing in Ukraine is just indicative of what they've seen in the past and what is sure to happen in the future anytime the United States wants Europe to fight an American adversary.
Right. And there's a lot of theories as to why that's going on that are economically driven that maybe we'll avoid for now. But so you think that the primary use of strategic nuclear weapons then is for deterrence, and that there's a very low risk of these being utilized? Is there anything that might, we're entering an age of, don't need to tell you, but information warfare and all this stuff. Is there any accidents that could happen that might trigger? Obviously, Russia is building up and modernize its nuclear weapons program. They wouldn't be doing that if they, didn't think that there was an obvious risk of a full-blown confrontation. Could you just elaborate a bit on what the prospect for the strategic warfare is, and maybe any misconceptions about just that, nuclear full-blown mad scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. So there's a lot going on in that one simple question, right? So first, it's important to understand that the strategy of deterrence, nuclear deterrence, that's not an opinion. That is an actual military doctrine. A doctrine that was developed by the United States coming out of World War II, a doctrine that's been adopted by multiple nuclear-powered countries, China, Russia, India. These countries have learned that having nuclear capability is a deterrent from other countries using their nuclear capability. So the concept of nuclear hedging, which is the actual formal doctrinal term, the military strategic term, nuclear hedging, is very similar to a hedge between two houses, right? So I don't know if you go to a wealthy neighborhood in the United States, whether you're in California or Florida, you'll see these large, tall hedges, bushes that are shaped, but you can't see through them. The whole idea behind hedging your house, hedging the property line of your house, is to make sure that your neighbor can't see what you're doing. Nuclear hedging works the same way. Only the hedge that they put up is a hedge of secrecy, so that nobody really knows if they are nuclear capable, how advanced their nuclear capability is, how many nukes they have, et cetera, et cetera. So when you look at North Korea, when you look at Iran, who are developing nuclear weapons, hedging is a super powerful strategy for them because you and I don't actually know what's happening on the other side of the hedge. Do they have nuclear weapons? Do they have delivery vehicles to launch those nuclear weapons? How many do they have? How big is the yield? Who helps engineer it for them? We're lost. All of that is blind to us because of the nuclear hedging doctrine. And it's an effective doctrine that we will continue to see not just nation states use, but third-party threats used, right? That's what we were afraid of with Al-Qaeda. It's one of the biggest threats that we had, the Islamic State. It's one of our big concerns right now with Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis. Can they get their hands on some kind of nuclear device? What if Ukraine gets their hands on a nuclear device?
Wow, I've never heard it quite articulated in that way with the use of the term nuclear hedging. I'm going to have to use that one. Now, interestingly, you brought up Iran, and obviously Israel is using this tactic of nuclear hedging a lot because it's shrouded in secrecy, their nuclear program. So in shifting the conversation towards the Middle East then, what the hell is going on in the Middle East? I mean, it's a big question. You've provided an explanation of what happened on October 7th. On October 8th, you came out with a video and you broke it all down, you know, how it pertains to Saudi Arabia. And I'll post a link to that in the description of this video so people can go and check it out. But yeah, like how does the nuclear card factor in? And I hope to get your thoughts on, I'm going to ask you 10 questions here and you can just bounce around as much as you want. I have a tendency to do this. If you have Iran who potentially has nuclear weapons, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, whether or not they do, and as well as Israel's nuclear weapon program and how this all factors into what's going on right now.
Yeah, so the Middle East is a mess. What's important to understand, though, Nate, is that the Middle East has been a mess for decades. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has come so much to the front page of newspapers around the world, that has just been ignored by most of us going back to before 2007. The only part of the world that has not been ignoring that issue is the Muslim world. And if you leave the United States, if you leave North America and you go anywhere in the world where there's a Muslim population, very much alive in their hearts and souls is the systematic repression of the Palestinian people in Israel. And this is not my opinion, Nate, right? I understand that people get sensitive about this. Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, multiple international organizations have outright said that Israel is participating in human rights abuses of the Palestinian people inside the boundary state of Israel. It's common knowledge, well documented. There's tons of evidence out there. It wasn't a narrative that was ever adopted by the West, because the narrative of the West is we must protect Israel. In reality, what the West is really trying to say is that we must protect Judaism, because Judaism was at risk of being eradicated during World War II. So the whole liberating forces, we all came together to protect Judaism and to protect genocide of the Jewish people. Somehow the narrative is transformed since the 1960s into thinking that Jewish people are Israelis or that Israelis constitute Judaism. We're conflagrating states with religions. And one of the things that makes democracy so powerful is the separation of church and state. So what Israel chooses to do politically is not the voice of Jews or Judaism. And we're getting confused by that. So you see in the United States, especially on October 8th, you saw massive support for Israel. Right? Oh my gosh, they were attacked. It's their version of 9/11. We have to kill Hamas. We have to do everything we can. Within 2 weeks, the popularity of that idea had already shifted because 2 weeks of watching Israel systematically bomb innocent people in the Gaza Strip, which they control, was enough on social media in the information age for people to start asking themselves, wait a second, what are we doing here? Is this really the right thing? Hamas is an elected government. The UN does not see Hamas as a terrorist organization. Most of the world negotiates with Hamas. Even President Biden is negotiating with Hamas. And the United States has a strict code of not negotiating with terrorists. So how do we call Hamas a terrorist group and at the same time acknowledge that we are negotiating with them on behalf of Israel? It makes the whole thing difficult for people to comprehend and understand, and rightfully so, because what we're seeing is how much of a mess the Middle East is and how twisted the narrative has been that we've all been raised on and conditioned to understand from the time that we were kids, right? When you and I were children, Nate, there was no internet. There was no, smartphone. There was no 24-hour news cycle. The world has developed and evolved so much faster than politics and policy has evolved.
And what are your predictions for this? Because apparently the ceasefire is now off. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. Well, at least for now, the bombing has started again in the last 12 hours.
Oh my gosh.
What do you think the potential outcome is here with respect to Hezbollah's involvement, the Houthi involvement, and then the Iranian question?
Yeah, so I'll answer the Iranian question first. Iran is behind this. Anybody with any kind of military or intelligence background knows that Iran is behind this. Hamas has no funding source. They have no tax base. They have no indigenous capability of creating anything other than barrage missiles. So all of their support comes from Iran. They also have, because they are also a genuine political humanitarian organization, they also have lots of donations that come from the Muslim world. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, all drive money to support the plight of the Palestinian people. It makes sense logically that part of that money would be carved out to also support the military wing of Hamas. But without a doubt, we know that Iran supports Hamas, just like Iran supports the Houthis and Iran supports Hezbollah. So it's in Iran's best interest to keep this conflict going. It's in Hamas's best interest to keep this conflict going, because every day that Israel kills more Palestinians, the world turns against Israel. The world becomes less supportive. The world becomes more critical. Israel is forced to challenge its relationships with its very few allies who support it financially, because it creates stress in those other countries, like what's happening in the United States right now, right? And what's all across Europe, you're seeing marches supporting Palestine. You're not seeing marches supporting Israel. So the world is turning against Israel. That is exactly what Iran wants. That's exactly what Hamas wants. Because if Israel creates this self-imposed ostracism from the rest of the world, then that just empowers the Palestinian plight and empowers Hamas's one stated objective of creating a Palestinian state within the nation borders of Israel, right? So unfortunately, Israel is stuck in a strategic rock and a hard place. If they continue to engage in mass killing, the world will turn against them. If they stop, it looks like they lose. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place where really their only option is to put Israeli lives at risk and start carrying out advanced surgical military operations within Palestinian-held territories where they can demonstrate that they are differentiating between Hamas leadership and Hamas military versus Palestinian civilians. And if they do that, their 300,000 person army is going to be put at a real risk.
Yeah, and they have a limited amount of manpower. It's already taking its toll on the economy there by pulling those troops off of other, occupations that they would fulfill within the country. How do you explain the Sunni Shiite divide with the Iranians being Shiite and the Hamas allegedly being Sunni? And do you think that that was the sole motive on October 7th, that it was to provoke this massive response, or could there have been other aims of that operation?
No. So for me, in my opinion, the primary driver behind October 7th was to create the chaos that we're seeing right now. If you take yourself back to October 7th, Nate, just go back in time. The United States, which is the whole world knows is the top supporter of Israel, had just gone through a major change in the House, in the House of Congress, right? We lost our Speaker of the House. Without a Speaker of the House, legislation can't be passed in the United States. So in that absence of a leader, this plan was executed because Hamas, supported by Iran, knew full well that the Biden administration would not be able to rush in and help Israel. And the United States was already heavily taxed in Ukraine. The 2 years of conflict in Ukraine has created incredible financial, military, political, and social stressor on the United States. Another strong, proven military doctrine is no country can win a war on two fronts. What happened with the invasion of October 7th, the incursion on October 7th, is now the United States is engaged in proxy wars on two fronts. And everybody inside the United States, all your secretaries of major departments, your chiefs of staff, they all understand we won't win if we let two wars happen simultaneously. And that's just two. Who's the biggest threat to the West?
China. And
they haven't even made their move yet. So we know what kind of predicament we're in. The leadership in the United States, the leadership in Europe, the leadership in Canada, we understand we're in a dangerous place. The question becomes, are our enemies coordinating themselves faster than we're able to coordinate ourselves? Because the second big geopolitical question that I want to make sure I highlight for you and your audience, the second biggest geopolitical question is, how is the world dividing right now? Because we are seeing the world break into two different alliances. There's a Western alliance and a non-Western alliance. If you think about it economically, we're basically talking about the G20 countries and the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries it's an acronym that stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But in the last 5 or 7 years, they've gone from being just a 5-country alliance to being a 13-country alliance that includes former American allies like the UAE, Indonesia, they include Iran. So this is a group that's economically invested in each other, and they are actually producing GDP faster than what the G20 countries are creating GDP. So we're actually seeing a shift in economic power around the world from your European and American democracies are creating less economic power, and your non-Western democracies are creating more economic power. And I mean, if anybody remembers anything from Econ 101, the world is driven by economic decisions.
And so what is so Israel, you said they're going to have to do this surgically, otherwise it's going to escalate beyond their control. What is the prospect then? Because it seems like a masterful move on the part of the Iranians to do this at this point in time. And like you say, it does start to look coordinated at the highest level. Is the stated goal then, or maybe not the stated goal, and I don't know if it is, I guess there's this debate about whether or not this is their stated goal of taking out Israel. If that is the goal, what is the likelihood of Israel leveraging their mysterious nuclear tools to perhaps prevent that from escalating?
Yeah, I don't see Israel executing using any kind of nuclear device. If Israel uses a nuclear device, they are cutting themselves off from any foreign support. What's more likely is you'll see them execute using their Mossad and special operations covert action capabilities, potentially even within Iran itself. So Israel is in a position where it has to turn to surgical action because on a public stage, it is going to continue to lose favor. Netanyahu knows that, and Netanyahu is already in a position where he does not have public favor. But the real question is, how is the United States going to guide Israel? Because remember that the United States is currently being led by a liberal government that is wildly unpopular, and they're going into an election year after coming off of 2 to 3 of the worst years in the United States' recent history, between COVID, Ukraine, the crash of the American dollar, the increase in interest rates, the persistent inflation of the dollar. I mean, the United States is in a nasty place politically. And in order to maintain a liberal government, in order to maintain a non-Republican, non-conservative base, they have to win another election this upcoming year. So they can't let Israel do something that makes them lose favor, makes the United States Democratic Party lose favor. They also have to do the same thing in Ukraine. So Israel's kind of shackled right now by its own allies. Its allies won't let it continue doing what it's doing. The longer it does continue air raids and bombing campaigns, killing women and children that everybody sees, the longer that happens, the worse of an ally Israel looks to the West. So Israel has to figure it out, and the United States has to guide them through it. Meanwhile, I don't think it was a masterful move on the part of Iran to launch this attack. I think that Hamas and Iran had this attack planned for a long time. It was just a matter of when they would pull the trigger. And that the trigger pull was informed by Iran's relationships with Russia and China, who are all collectively looking towards engaging and accelerating the shift of economic power away from the West and into the non-West.
It would seem that if the United States didn't want to enable this behavior that they're seeing in Israel, they wouldn't situate a large part of their Navy in and around the Middle East. What do you make of this massive naval presence in the Middle East right now?
Yeah, part of it, you got to keep in mind too, the United States is always the United States wants to be the world's most effective military. The only way you become the most effective at anything is through practice and exercise. So every opportunity the United States gets to exercise their military power, exercise their military deployment capabilities, their military tools, their military strategies, every chance they get to exercise them, they will. Because the country that has the capability but doesn't exercise it will eventually lose the capability. So this deployment to the Middle East sends a message to multiple Middle Eastern countries that the United States is still capable of supporting them, which makes Saudi Arabia feel good, and it makes UAE feel good, it makes Oman feel good. But it also sends a message to Iran that we have advanced capabilities that can neutralize your threats if we need to. But here's the thing, the United States does not want to launch missiles into Yemen. They don't want to launch missiles into Lebanon. They don't want to do those things because now all of a sudden it goes from being a proxy war to being an interstate war where the United States is actively engaging in conflict. So again, it's a show. The United States has to show that they're strong and show that they're willing without ever crossing the boundary into committing to another war.
Interesting. Because I would see that as, if Israel knew this presence was there and had their back, it would almost enable them to continue what they're doing.
This is how you know Israel knows they have the power there, but there's no way Israel thinks the United States has their back. This is not the bro code, right, dude? Like if you and I go into a bar, I've got your back. That means if you do something stupid, I still have your back, right? I'm not going to let you get your ass kicked in a bar unless we both get our ass kicked in the bar. That's how we work. That's the bro code. In politics, there's a very important message that everybody understands, like statesmen, professional statesmen understand. There are no permanent friends. There are only permanent interests. Israel might be a friend today, but that doesn't mean they're going to be a friend in 10 years. China was a friend at the end of World War II. China is now the largest threat to the United States.
But it seems, though, like when we've basically given them carte blanche in terms of the weapons, the lack of oversight of the nuclear program, it seems a unique relationship that's enduring and almost unconditional. What sort of event would trigger a separation there?
I mean, you're already starting to see the events that would trigger a separation, right? Nobody can stomach. The Western governments can't stomach 33,000 deaths in Palestine in exchange for 1,200 deaths in Israel. Nobody. I mean, already you're seeing that there are conditions on this support. I understand what you're saying, man. I totally understand what you're saying. Because if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, we'd be in a totally different kind of conversation. Because 15 years ago, we didn't have the same sort of access to information that we do now. The voting base could not literally watch the war unfold on their laptop or in their cell phone. But we live in an era now where we do have that kind of access to information.
Yeah, I guess my concern would be, and I agree with you about the fact that there are no permanent relationships, and I like the way you articulate that because I've been thinking about that very concept about how nations switch sides, but how to put it so short and succinctly. But my concern would be if there ever was that separation and then you have isolated Israel in between Turkey, Egypt, Iran with nuclear weapons. I mean, that situation could get out of control wildly fast.
That's true. And that's that's a big part of why the United States doesn't want to separate from Israel. The United States has, and by way of the United States, multiple Western allies, right? Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes countries, the UK. These countries have invested so much into places like Israel, places like Taiwan, other areas of the world where there has been, where there are tremendous economic benefits, but a history of some kind of oppression or repression. So they don't want to separate. They want to keep themselves close because if they think about their long-term interests, they want to maintain those relationships. One of the things that nobody talks about is that Israel is the third wealthiest country on the Asian continent. Third wealthiest. They are the top exporter of diamonds. We don't give them weapons, we sell them weapons. So having a relationship with Israel absolutely serves American interests. We make money from the Israelis, we get intelligence from the Israelis. There's all sorts of benefits there. We don't want to lose those benefits, but we also don't want to support them through this, global faux pas that they're in the middle of right now. So we have to find some sort of grounds. So the idea of ever separating from them, which I agree with you, if a country was truly isolated, it significantly increases the risk that they will do something brash or brazen, like engage a nuclear weapon. But we are living in a world where we understand politically, militarily, and doctrinally that you create alliances specifically so that you don't have to turn to those more brazen tactics. Now, again, think about it, man. If a briefcase nuclear weapon goes off in Tehran and kills the Ayatollah, think about the chaos that would cause. Was it Iranian? I'm sorry, was it Israeli? Was it American? Was it European? Was it Ukrainian? Was it some other country that also has beef with Iran? To your point about Sunni and Shia, there's all sorts of conflict within the Muslim world between Iran and Iran's ambitions and essentially the rest of the Khaliji Arab world, which is oil-rich Arabs, right? They're Sunni, Iran is Shia, and Iran is absolutely trying to take over that part of the world. They're not seen as much of a threat because there's such strong alliances in the Sunni nations.
So what do we know about Iran's nuclear program, really? I mean, they're building these deep underground military bunkers. They're putting all their strategic weapons underground. They got the centrifuges underground. Like, do you think they already have nukes? Is it their ambition to get nukes? What do you know about that?
Yeah, I mean, what I am under kind of a strict secrecy agreement for my time at the CIA. So what
I
I
was
will
waiting
say,
for that. I was waiting until we hit the wall. Yeah.
so what I'm going to say is outside of what I know is privileged information. Right? What I see as I watch Iran unfold in the last 5 to 7 years, right? They are much wealthier than anybody thinks. Iran is the breadbasket for the Middle East. They have the best farmland. They have the best agriculture. Their food is fantastic. I mean, when I lived in the Middle East, when I went grocery shopping, even I was in the UAE. The UAE is technically an adversary to Iran, but all of the produce in the grocery stores were imported from Iran. So there's a carve out in almost every country in the Middle East that allows them to do agricultural trade with Iran. So all of that money is going into Iran. So Iran is much wealthier than anybody thinks. And they have very healthy relationships with other developing nations, even though they don't have healthy relationships with Western countries. They have carve outs like they do in the Middle East. They have all sorts of benefits that we don't understand because we just write them off as some sort of podunk broken country. So without a doubt, they have the funding it takes to continue advancing their weapons. So do I think they have a nuclear capability? The probability is very high that they have the ability to create and deliver some kind of nuclear device. Do I believe that it is a sophisticated nuclear device? The probability of that is very low. Do I think they have the capability? Yes. Do I think they can trigger it? Possibly not. Do I think they can put it onto some sort of platform and deliver it via rocket? Possibly not. Right? And that's a big deal. It's one thing to be able to create a gun. It's something completely different to be able to create the soldier that can use the gun at an expert level. I still am voting a high probability that we see China move on Taiwan before we have a new American president.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.